Hello, my name is Julian Lee, and I'm happy to welcome you to another online lecture for intercultural communication. This week, we're taking a deeper look at some of the issues relating to the concept of culture. But I'd like to begin by telling you about one of my favourite fruits. Here you can see my father and me, while he attempts to knock down some avocados from one of his trees. My dad has a few avocado trees on his little plot of land in Malaysia, and when they are in season, they are magnificent. However, what has to be my favourite fruit on this little plot of land of his are his durian. This is a durian hanging from one of his trees. They are a large, spiky fruit, 2, 3, 4 kilograms in weight, and they are this attractive green colour. There's not much point to looking up in the trees for them, except to keep in mind how many more fruit are left to fall. You can close your eyes and open your nose, and the smell of the durian is very, very strong, and that smell will lead you to it. You can smell a durian from a long way away, and to me, I find the smell of the durian very appealing. However, not everyone feels this way. Let's hear from David Attenborough.
In Borneo, one fruit produces a smell so pungent that a sensitive nose can detect it from half a mile away. And some people like the taste of that fruit so much that they will walk for miles to find it. And so will others.
Oh, durian.
Ada?
Ada.
Oh, yeah, huh?
Ya,
Bagus?
bagus.
This is it, the famous durian.
Sama.
Terima kasih. I have to say, the smell to my nostrils, at any rate, is fairly disgusting. What an open sewer with just a dash of coal gas would be a fair description. But that comes from the rind. That's the advertisement. This is the fruit, and that's very different. That's very different. It's really pretty good. Kind of slimy caramel cream, perhaps, would be a description of this.
So whereas many Malaysians regard the taste as well as the smell of durians delicious, many others, especially those who are not familiar with the fruit, including David Attenborough, find it disgusting. And for that reason, you'll find durian banned from airlines as well as hotels throughout Southeast Asia. So here you have an example of how our cultural upbringing has a significant impact on the extent to which we find something palatable or disgusting, or right or wrong. These issues can have a significant impact on many things, including our human security. Take, for example, the issue of eating protein. It is highly efficient to create animal protein through harvesting and growing insects. However, because many of us are averse to eating grasshoppers and ants, we therefore expend a lot of resources in growing beef, lamb and chicken, which are an inefficient way of using the resources at hand. But while some examples of cultural difference are obvious, and while some things are clearly going to divide opinion as to whether they're disgusting or appetizing, right or wrong, pleasant or unpleasant, there are a whole array of things that it is difficult to know whether they are going to elicit a response of this sort of any kind. But take, for example, bathing, which we looked at a little bit in week 1. There surely can be nothing nicer than a nice hot bath at home, right?
Mayumi Hayashi, a social scientist, tells me that in Japan, the tradition remains strong.
It's very important indeed. It fulfills many roles. And apart from the obvious function of helping relaxation or ensuring hygiene, which is very important to the Japanese, it has major social functions, particularly as a way of bonding people together. So to the Japanese, there is nothing more natural for 2 or more people to share a bath.
However, in addition to the Japanese considering bathing a social activity, a further question is, how do they regard bathing alone?
Be honest now, when you consider a Westerner, getting into the bath and washing themselves in the bath, washing their hair, and then just lying there for a while, maybe thinking, maybe contemplating reading a book. What do you think of that?
Oh, it's just unimaginable.
A key point that the previous examples serve to make is that in cross-cultural encounters, we need to be careful about making judgments too quickly about the behaviors and beliefs of another society. When engaging with someone from a culture that is unfamiliar to us, there is much that will be uncertain. This is illustrated well on page 20 of the reading by Langani, where he describes the difficulties one might have in judging whether a stranger on a train in India, which is his example, who is asking about your family, is being rudely intrusive, or whether such questions are regarded as part of the standard conversation-making regime in India. So it is clear that different cultures have different attitudes and behaviors revolving around different things. Think, for example, if I were to ask you this question, point towards tomorrow. Point in the direction in which you would point if I asked you to please point towards tomorrow. An unusual question, but consider which way you would point. The image below demonstrates that people from different language groups tend to point in different directions when they are asked to point to tomorrow. And we could ask ourselves, why is that the case, that different language groups point to different directions? It is possible that we could say, well, that's just part of their culture. There's something about the culture that makes them point in different directions, and there we go. However, I think it is worth bearing in mind a note by Langani. He writes, and excuse me while I quote, "If any noticeable differences in attitudes, values, and behaviors are not easily understood, they are explained away in terms of cultural differences. The term culture may then become the wastebasket into which unexplainable, unacceptable social and moral behaviors are often dropped." One of the things that we don't want to do is to explain culture away. Now, when Langani writes that, what is he saying? Well, let me give you an example. Let us say we asked ourselves, why is it that the Irish are associated with this alcoholic beverage called stout, or Guinness stout? Is it just because of their culture? Irish people drink stout, or much more stout than many other people, because it is part of their culture. Now, Langani would say that this is not a great response. Here you are just saying that people act in a particular way because of their culture. It is not explaining anything. It is explaining this thing away. If we want to take a more constructive attitude, we might begin to look at the history and the context in which particular behaviours take place. Now, this is well exemplified in this following description of why stout took root in Ireland. Here we have Oz Clarke, a well-known wine expert, being assisted by James May, a well-known automobile expert, and a long tunnel.
Here. Now we're lost, and we've ended up underneath the famous Dublin brewery that makes the stout, with the creamy head on the top, and we've also found this rather fabulous tunnel, which we suspect is from the 19th century. And I have here Oz Clarke from the television, who is an expert on stout, its history and its relationship with another famous drink, which is porter, I believe. And his challenge is to explain it all to me, and indeed you, the viewers, within the length of this tunnel, which is, I would guess, 130 yards?
Okay. A couple of hundred years ago, most beers in Britain and Ireland were dark. They were called porter. Stout is a stronger version of porter, i.e. the stout porter is the stronger version of the porter. Okay, tax was levied on malted barley, not on unmalted barley. So what the Irish guys realised was if they used some unmalted barley, they could make more profit, sell things more easily. So what they did is they roasted barley, made it really like coffee beans, which made a fantastically black beer, much blacker than typical porter. That's how stout became fantastically famous. So famous, in fact, that during the 19th century, this brewery here was the largest brewery in Europe. And by 1914, this brewery here was the largest brewery in the world. Now, the First World War, very important. Lloyd George in England said you can't roast barley and roast malts because it's taking too much energy, or it's making bombs and Gatling guns and all that kind of stuff. So he didn't want to say that to the Irish, because the Irish were in a state of rebellion all the time. So while in England the idea of dark beers went out of fashion, in Ireland they got stronger and stronger and stronger, to the extent that in the Second World War the idea of stout was a bitter dark beer made in Ireland.
A holistic view of culture examines a particular behaviour or element of a culture in view of the history and other aspects of that culture that enable that behavior or that thing to make sense. A holistic view is one that leads us to a concept called cultural relativism. And this is a tricky concept that we'll be returning to a few times throughout this course. The concept of cultural relativism basically is that if we are to look at a particular behavior or something about a particular culture, it is difficult for someone else not part of that culture to judge it. If someone from another culture were to say about a particular behavior from another culture and say that it was wrong or inappropriate, the response could be, well, you don't understand the context in which this occurs. You have no right to make a judgment about it. Within the context of our culture, it makes perfect sense. Take the example of sharks in soup, which occurs regularly in banquets at celebratory occasions across Asia. However, there are people who regard the harvesting of sharks and shark's fins as inappropriate and should stop. However, it could be said that within the context of Asian society, it is difficult for us to say that eating sharks in soup is wrong, because within the context of the culture, it is appropriate. So cultural relativism is the idea that it is difficult, or impossible maybe, to make criticisms of other cultures because of the different cultural contexts at play. So a key connected issue with cultural relativism is the notion of ethnocentrism, which Ember, and Peregrine describe. They note that ethnocentrism is where judgments are based solely on one's own values without regard to the cultural context of the thing observed. So therefore, whereas cultural relativism takes the view that in order to understand a behavior in another culture, you need to understand how that behavior is situated and the meanings that are attributed to it in that culture, with ethnocentrism, those meanings and those connections and those contexts are not considered, and you judge that behavior based on the values of your own culture. A further opposite to ethnocentrism is the idea of romanticization. Whereas ethnocentrism often confers negative valuations to the behaviors of people in other societies, romanticization gives an unduly rosy picture of those other societies' values and behaviors, and often regards one's own culture and society as wholly flawed. Both ethnocentrism and romanticization are not constructive ways of approaching intercultural communication. So therefore that leads us to further interrogate the notion of culture. One of the things that Ember, and Peregrine note is that when thinking about culture, there have been a number of different ways of conceiving it. One of those, they note, is basically to view culture as somehow outside of oneself. Culture has often been thought of as a force beyond particular individuals. We see people walking around the streets behaving in particular ways, in very predictable ways, and it is almost as if there is something that is pushing people to behave in standard ways, to dress in particular ways, and to talk in particular ways, and to basically engage with each other in more or less the same way. Why do we all conform? Because there is a thing called culture that imposes its will from outside and makes us behave in that manner. This was a view that was popular in anthropology for quite a while, and I'm going to try and explain an alternative perspective through the example of durian and wine. So let me share a few observations of mine about the similarities between durian and wine, and hopefully that will lead us to explain a number of things about culture. In my view, durian and wine are similar in a number of ways. One, there is an emphasis on smelling as an indication of quality. Two, there is anticipation prior to opening. Both the durian and the wine are of uncertain quality until one actually opens the bottle or opens the durian. For both the wine and the durian, there is a real chance of the contents being spoiled. A wine may have been left too long, or might be corked, or a durian might have been attacked by squirrels or other animals, or have been left also too long. If there's a good example of a good durian or a good wine, then that is often accompanied by some excitement. And in my view, both durian and wine are fundamentally social things to consume. I would no more consider eating a good durian on my own than drinking a good wine on my own. And for both durian and wine in particular, there is a large vocabulary and discourse, if you like, about describing the flavors, the varieties, and the smells. And a further important point is that learning to appreciate durian, and in particular wine, is something that can be learned. And so here we have Oz Clarke attempting to teach James May how to appreciate and to talk about wine.
Thank God.
You're going to have to learn how to taste wine properly, okay? So let's start right at the beginning. Firstly, 3 things. Don't put it down. So look at it.
I've looked at the wine.
Right, second thing. Shove your nose in. Like that, and I want you to get first impressions. What's the first thing that comes into your mind about that wine?
Fruit.
Don't try and take the piss or concentrate, okay? Take it slightly seriously.
Okay, but
This is what you do.
sorry. Okay, I'll do it again.
Asking about.
But what's
You
that
didn't, you didn't ask me what I was doing.
No, but you sort of chew it. You were
Yeah,
chewing
the whole
it.
point is, if you get wine in your mouth, and then you mix it with oxygen, by doing that, you massively improve the flavour.
Sort of whiny.
So although maybe James May is not taking it very seriously, one of the points to take home from this is that wine appreciation is something that can be learned. There are some people in the society that are better at it, and they're able to teach others about it. And part of that learning is learning the vocabularies that go along with it. So here you have a chart that describes the various ways of describing the characteristics of wine, whether it's husky, walnut, coconutty, piquant, and so on. This is a whole vocabulary that one does pick up after some association with wine culture. So not only are the flavors and the smells described, but also there's a vocabulary that goes along with the color of it, and there's a whole understanding of how to pair wine with particular kinds of food. What the example of wine tells us is that wine appreciation is a field of endeavor with an especially developed vocabulary, array of skills, aptitudes, and knowledge associated with it. And furthermore, not all persons within a society that might be regarded as a wine society will be similarly accomplished. Some people in France or Australia will be regarded as being more expert than others. For those who are unfamiliar with this part of society, they won't be able to meet the expectations of those who are competent in a given cultural setting. So here we have an example of this, where James May is being made to describe a particular wine in front of these highly accomplished people.
Hurt you. Shove it up your nose and give it a good snort.
Now this is a rich white Bordeaux to start with. The Chateau Soudbureau 2001 comes in at around £40 a bottle. What I'm hoping for here is words like peaches, apricots, pineapple and honey.
Wow, I just got it there. It is dope. Dope? You know, like model aeroplane dope. It's got a slight, in that it makes your head go a bit.
I don't know what model airplane dope is like.
It's like one of those things that you're supposed to leave a window open.
So there you can see that James failed miserably. But one of the key points is that these skills can be learned. And this has...
James, I hate you. Our last wine is the 1988 Pichon Baron, £54 a bottle. It's slightly more acidic, and he should be picking up a slight hint of tobacco. But don't hold your breath.
Bonfire. Definite bonfire in there. And a definite barbecued sausage, or something like that.
Sausage?
A slight sort of pork fat high note or low note. Is that...
So impressed, because it is exactly what I'm getting the point.
Maybe even a little bit of Virginian tobacco.
At last.
So among other things, within a particular culture, there is a great deal of difference in familiarity of people with different aspects of that culture. And this leads us to our attempt to understand culture from the perspective of the individual member of society. So I'm going to draw in here the understanding of culture developed by the anthropologist Ward Goodenough. So Ward Goodenough examines culture from the perspective of individuals. So you remember before we talked about how culture is sometimes thought of as this force that is external to people and is responsible for making them behave in the way that they do. However, Ward Goodenough takes a particular view, which is that of the individual who learns the culture whilst growing up in society. So, individuals develop their own private subjective view of the world and its contents. This outlook includes the various standards for perceiving, evaluating, believing, and doing that he attributes to other persons as a result of his experience of their actions and admonitions. Therefore, for example, when James May behaves badly in front of Oz Clarke puts on this disappointed face. This is an admonition of James May's behaviour, and hopefully in the future James May will behave differently and more appropriately. And when he does behave appropriately, then he'll be rewarded with a more positive expression on Oz Clarke's face. Similarly, if a child behaves badly, he receives an admonition, a scolding, or a telling off from his parents, and from that he learns to behave more appropriately according to the norms of his society. And so through these individual actions and events, people learn how to behave according to the norms of their culture. So it is not necessarily that culture imposes its values and beliefs on particular individuals somehow from outside. These cultural beliefs and norms develop in the course of people's day-to-day actions as a result of their encounters with other people. And by using these standards as a guide, people behave in ways that make sense to other people, and so therefore they can function in their society. In the course of growing up, we begin to see other people in terms of the categories to which they belong. And when we perceive a person as belonging to a particular category of person, then we behave in different ways accordingly. So therefore, if we are interacting with, for example, old people, we might behave in a particular way that's different compared to if we were to encounter a doctor in his clinic. The behavioral norms amongst old people are different to those that apply to doctors. And similarly, if we go out to a concert with friends our own age, there are a different set of behavioral expectations that apply in that context as well. So therefore, we learn how to behave in different contexts with different people with different behaviors. The standards that a person attributes to a particular set of others are for him the culture of that set, writes Ward Goodenough. And because a person attributes different standards to different sets of others, he perceives these sets as having different cultures. What Ward Goodenough is saying is that even within a particular culture, there are different groups of people who behave differently, and we sometimes think of these different groups of people, whether they are wine experts, whether they are doctors, whether they are lawyers, as having different kinds of cultures. And so therefore, in Goodenough's opinion, all people are in effect multicultural. A person growing up in any society will be competent in more than one culture. Just as individuals may be multilingual, they can also be multicultural. So therefore, we know how to behave with old people, and we know how to behave in a doctor's office. And these different contexts and these different people constitute different cultures with which we know how to interact. However, just because we are familiar with how to interact with people from a different cultural set doesn't mean that we necessarily identify with those people. Because you know how to behave in a doctor's office doesn't make you a doctor. Because you know how to function in France doesn't make you French. So in summary, by taking the perspective of how individuals learn to operate in their society, we can move away from seeing culture as a single thing to which people do or don't belong. We instead move towards seeing individuals as learning how to function in an array of contexts within a given society. The different standards of behavior in those contexts or groups each constitutes separate cultures. People learn the different standards and expectations of different sets of people, and therefore, in Goodenough's view, they are multicultural. Individuals will become competent in an array of cultures, some of which are widely shared, some of which are not. And although a person may be competent in a particular culture, that does not mean that they will necessarily regard it as their own. As was noted before, just because you can function well in France doesn't necessarily mean that you regard yourself as French. So our understanding of culture has an array of impacts on the way we understand ourselves and issues such as cultural relativism. If there is so much diversity of behaviours and attitudes and knowledge within cultures, then it can be difficult to state that people of a specific culture believe in X, Y, or Z. For example, there is the idea that in much of Asia, that shark's fin soup is a key feature to any celebratory dinner. However, this part of the culture has been criticised for two reasons. One, because it leads to a depletion in the number of sharks in the sea, and two, because it is regarded as being cruel, because the sharks have their fins cut off and are thrown back into the sea still alive but unable to swim. But the question is, can Asian cultures be criticised for this because it is part of their culture? This is a question relating to cultural relativism. However, one of the things to realise is that much of the push for the banning of shark's fin soup actually occurs from members of the particular culture and society in which it is taking place. So therefore, it is many people in Asia who are pushing for this ban of shark's fin soup. So, in summary, I've elaborated on a number of important points. One is that culture can be seen from the perspective of the individual in a society. And a person in a society will be familiar with a number of different cultures within that society. 2. Culture is not a unitary whole. There are differences within cultures, and this was exemplified by the issue of shark's fin soup just now, that there are people who object to it even though it is ostensibly part of their culture. And 3, culture arises out of material and concrete circumstances and has a history. And today we've also covered a number of key concepts and issues. We've expanded our understanding of culture, we've addressed the issue of how we judge the behaviours and beliefs of others, and we've discussed the concept of cultural relativism. We've covered a lot of ground today, so I'll leave it there for now. Thanks for tuning in.